Thank you, Dr. Wu, and thank you, Sabra, for having me be a guest speaker today. As Dr. Wu said, my name is Lequina Myles, and today I'll be talking to you about clinical supply chain management, balancing the opportunities, threats, and patients. Prior to my current role at Phenomenex, I did work in the clinical supply chain industry for approximately 5 years. I was the regional director for the Americas region, so I provided a lot of quality oversight for multiple clinical trials, ranging from medical device to biotech, cell and gene therapies, direct to patient, and even some trials that were global. So today I'm very excited to share some of my experience, my knowledge with you. And my dissertation was on implementation strategies for cell and gene therapies as well. So just a brief disclaimer, these slides are for educational purposes, and this is based on the feedback of the author. So it is not based on any opinions of any of the organizations that I either work for or affiliated with. And I've also provided copies of the slides to Dr. Wu so that you're able to go through them as well. So you don't have to take notes frantically. And I know there may be questions throughout the presentation. I am not able to see those questions, so I will pause periodically, but also if there's questions that come up, I have left time at the end to have questions. So on the agenda today, I'm just going to give an overview of clinical supply chain management, and I'm going to also talk about some of the current trends in clinical supply chain, specifically focusing on a lot of the challenges that I think were mentioned in the previous slides, such as cold chain management, data and documentation, and also chain of custody. I am also going to provide an overview of some of the research I conducted and some of the lessons learned from clinical supply chain management that just not impact the clinical trial phases, but also may impact commercial development as products move through the product pipeline. And then I'm also going to give some insights on views on supply chain management. And then at the end, like I said, we'll have questions. So hopefully after this discussion, you'll have a general overview of what clinical supply chain management is and the impact in the product portfolio as far as drug development and the implications for commercialization. I also will provide an overview and oversight of some of the operational as well as the regulatory challenges that we've seen, not just here locally, but also in other regions of the world, as well as focus on an area that I think is very up and coming and at the forefront, which is our precision therapies, such as cell and gene therapies, which I believe have a very unique supply chain strategy than what's have seen from their predecessors, such as synthetic chemical molecules and also large molecule biologics. And then COVID-19, although we're still seeing supply chain management challenges, I think this is an area that did provide additional opportunities and visibility to some of the gaps that have been a part of clinical supply chain management, but biopharma supply chain management overall. So I wanted to highlight some of the findings there as well as the opportunities. So what is supply chain management? Most often when I speak about supply chain management, even from the pharmaceutical side, I often experience, oh, you work for Amazon, or what I call is the Amazon effect. And most people associate supply chain management with Amazon because I think Amazon has been able to perfect the ability to have orders come to a customer's door within a 2-hour period, same day. So it's almost like customizing the supply chain based on the preferences of the customer. And what we're seeing from the clinical supply chain side is that it's no different for clinical trials, especially when we start to move towards precision and personalized medicine, where supply chain is almost tailored towards the patient. So supply chain management has over 200 definitions. So you may hear transportation, distribution, logistics. It also has many stakeholders, not just the customer or the patient, but there's other things like contract manufacturers, clinical resource organization, hospital personnel, airport personnel, and even external or internal customers and vendors within or outside of your organization. But for the sake of this PowerPoint and this presentation, I'm going to narrow down supply chain management and provide a definition, which is the active management of supply chain activities required to plan, control, execute a product's flow from acquiring the raw materials through production all the way to distribution to the final customer. And when thinking about clinical supply chain, this is not just the development of the drug and production of that clinical trial sample or material that the patient will receive. It is about the entire pipeline up into receipt from the clinician and where that product may be dispensed directly to the patient. And then we'll also focus on 3 areas and 3 workflows. So the physical material itself, which often is the product or the investigational medicinal product. However, there may be other components and contents that may be a part of the box. You also have to think about the flow of information. So this may include things like bill of lading, patient information, and things that are required to keep your product safe and effective during the cold chain management. And then more so when you think about financial transactions, you have to think about the costs associated with the clinical supply chain. Most often, supply chain management is about 25% of your overall clinical trial costs. Now, these financial transactions do all overpour on the commercial side when you think about reimbursement as well as payers. But for the sake of this presentation, just thinking about the process of the actual material, the flow of information, and also those transactions as they take place, especially if you have a situation where you have a product that may go out of temperature range and it results in spoilage. That can be a huge financial impact. So I wanted to highlight the evolution of drug development. And the reason why I wanted to highlight this is because over the past 10 years, we've seen a significant change and shift in drug development. Most of the products that are being created are very niche, personalized, they require cold chain management, and they have to adhere to very strict temperatures. And in some cases, some of these products can be shaken, turned upside down, or it will result in the product not being safe or effective for the patient. So when you think of it from a supply chain perspective, things that used to work when you have maybe synthesized drugs that don't require, cold chain management, we are now seeing a shift in the supply chain industry where we are now seeing personalized clinical supply chain management systems, where in some cases you are tailoring the supply chain, or what we may refer to as logistics by design, based on your clinical trial. So not just the clinical trial itself, your patient population, the profile of your product. In some cases, if you have patients in remote areas, you may choose to use decentralized trials, which means you don't have a brick and mortar clinical trial site. You actually are dispensing these products within the patient's homes. And this creates additional challenges just because these innovations are not necessarily captured in a lot of the guidelines and regulations thus far. And if you also think about some of these modalities and the complex science of these modalities, it becomes very difficult to control the supply chain management once the product leaves the manufacturer's visibility. So I wanted to provide 2 examples here. If you think about a standard pharmaceutical supply chain, most often you will have a shipment, it will leave a manufacturer. If you're thinking about commercial product, it may go to a repackager, a wholesaler, or a distribution center, and ultimately end up at a pharmacy, a hospital, a clinical site where it's either dispensed by a doctor or dispensed by a pharmacist. When you get into clinical supply chain, it's quite different because it's not bulk material. Many times there is a limited amount of samples, and you're almost creating and also developing your clinical profile based on the response of the participants and the subjects in your actual clinical trial. So as you see, the distribution pathways get quite extensive as you look at how are you going to require the raw material? What are going to be your active ingredients? What comparator materials are you going to use? What is your finished product? Where are your clinical sites going to be located? Again, where's your patient population and profile? And as we start to become more globalized with trials, it becomes very difficult as you see the exchange of these pathways. And then you also have to think about vendors like your contract manufacturer and even your clinical resource organization that may be providing oversight to your trial. In many cases for global trials, you may have several contract manufacturers that may not be in the same region. So your product may be delivered in maybe developed or created in a different country, then have to be delivered to a patient who may be in a very different continent, different geography. And you have to think about things like, is there a local airport there? Or what will be your distribution plans in order to make sure that product reaches the patient in the time that is required? Now, if you think about a typical, and I use this as a very foundational clinical supply chain management touch point, again, you have the manufacturer, your product is created, it goes outbound to a warehouse, most often is collected by a driver, routed to an airline, and then it's transported. And again, this could be airplane, truck, or sea, depending on where you're located. Your product then has to go through custom clearance, get recovered by a handler at the port of entry, delivered to a distributor, transported to the site, go through the hands of the site coordinator, then go to the clinician and the patient. And research has shown for an average product, especially from a clinical trial standpoint, you may have between 20 to 25 touch points across 5 to 6 different geographies. And if you think about these touch points, as I mentioned earlier, there's different categories that are implied or are part of this clinical supply chain as you move these products throughout the touch points. So you're going to have your medical product itself. You may have to move or ship raw materials. Depending on your clinical trial, if it's going to be a competitor trial or you have an active or a placebo, all of those things have to be shipped as well. You also have to think about the biological material because, again, most often with clinical trials, it's based on the response of the subject. So you may be waiting for blood samples, tissue samples, cells, all of these things, again, could be very time sensitive and temperature sensitive. And if these shipments are missed, then the patient may actually miss their dosage. You also have ancillary supplies such as diagnostic kits, infusion bags, and tubing and reagents. And in certain cases, if you are using in vitro diagnostics or have combination diagnostics or combination devices where you have to use certain delivery systems in order to provide the drug to the patient, these also become a part of your supply chain as they're shipped to and from. And then you also have to think about things like inventory management. And again, getting those to the clinical site on time so that the patient is able to receive treatment. Now, other things that are not as tangible as your material, your biological samples, are things like packaging. As mentioned earlier, it's very important that you understand your product profile. It's very important that you have the proper packaging so you prevent spoilage of your material. And then you also want to think about things like GPS systems, track and trace devices. If you have certain material, they do have to be sealed in a biohazard bag, and that's just to prevent explosion of the samples once they go into the airplane due to the pressure in the cabin of an airplane. And then also seals and zip ties. If things aren't packaged properly, your product may be offloaded just to ensure that you are not passing on any type of biohazards as your product is moved through the supply chain pipeline. Documentation. Some products require import and export records. You also want to have your bill of lading. Patient information will also be a part of this in a clinical trial. And then ultimately, you want to make sure that you have good documentation practices and you have a full chain of custody of your product, again, as it moves through the pipeline. For biologics, in many of these modalities that are temperature sensitive, cold chain management. So not just the temperature of the package, but as you start to transport your product, or do the airports have cold chain? Is cold chain accessible in the region that you're going to ship your product to? Are you going to use temperature monitors to ensure that your product maintain the temperature through transit? And last, but certainly not least, and most importantly, is the data. And there's a lot of data that is transferred through the supply chain. So it may be virtual data where you're uploading documents to a system. It also could be verbal communication between you and your vendor, also internal and external communication. And then you're going to have a lot of written data as well that you have to reconcile. So for example, once your product reaches a site, it's up to the site personnel to review all of documentation and making sure that the product is dispensed to the appropriate patient. So now I'm going to transition a bit and talk about some of the operational and regulatory landscape. As I mentioned earlier, the evolution of a lot of these modalities and also the evolution of our products and innovation. When you think about clinical supply chain management, I like to think of it of the convergence of supply chain management itself, as well as healthcare and also the biopharmaceutical industry. And the reason for that is because clinical supply chain, again, is not just tailored and is a part of the actual patient, but you also have to think about hospital personnel. Many times for some of these clinical trials, clinical sites, these different organizations don't necessarily adhere to FDA, GMP, GCP, et cetera. So you almost have a conversion of understanding the different regulations in the clinical supply chain landscape. We've also seen different innovations in all of the areas, supply chain management, healthcare, as well as biopharma. So for example, medical products, precision medicine, cell and gene therapies are very complex, very niche. And when you think about personalized medicine, where you're using a patient's cells as a therapy, it becomes much more important that you almost have 100% execution in your supply chain, just because those clinical trials cost about $400,000 per patient. And not only that, those samples are not easily replaced. Most often they take about 30 days to produce that medication. And if the patient misses the dose, that can be catastrophic for those patients, because in many cases, patients that receive these medications or at end of life, this is their last resort for them to go into remission, et cetera, or find a cure in order for them to sustain their life years. Again, the complexity of trials are also changing, so they're becoming less predictable, very customized clinical trials. Again, global trials adds additional stakeholders. And then we also have the nuance of decentralized trials, again, where you're not going to a clinical site. So you have to think, how do you control the supply chain environment within a patient's home? Complexities in supply chain for direct-to-patient home healthcare. Again, when you have products that's being dispensed to a patient's home, how do you maintain things like validation of equipment, humidity, cold chain? And then we're also seeing a lot of innovative technologies in supply chain, such as interactive response technology, where a patient can scan a QR code and they're able to see what type of medication they're receiving and also see some of their health history. You have blockchain and things like smart packaging, where you're able to, again, track your product throughout the supply chain, but also see things if your product was tipped, if there was bouncing, if it was exposed to x-rays. And then in certain locations where, again, you may not have any airports, et cetera, we are seeing delivery of medications, as well in certain cases, delivery of things like plasma, et cetera, via drones. Again, all of these new technologies are very exciting for the industry, but then they come with other complexities as to what are the proper standards, what are the regulations, and how can you better control the supply chain as these products move throughout from one region to the next and then eventually to the patient. So looking at the drug development process flow, if you think about clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, your typical phase 3 studies, and again, this may depend on your product. Many of the cell and gene therapies, the clinical trials are very truncated. Instead of going for 5 to 10 years, many cases you may see a trial go up to 3 years. But as you see, if you think about distribution, most often manufacturers are thinking of distribution as a post-market activity. In many cases, distribution is regulated as a post-market activity, where when you think about clinical supply chain, you almost have to think about these distribution plans very early and the implication of those plans as you move towards regulatory approval. So for example, a lot of supply chain management is captured in your chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. It's not just the distribution part, but how you make the product. What vendors will you use? What material will go into your product? How will you transport this product? Where clinical sites are you going to use? And eventually, once you go for approval or application, how will you sustain that once your product is commercialized? So it's becoming much more important to think about distribution strategies, not just from the clinical side, but also as you commercialize your products. And then I wanted to highlight some of the regulations. Again, many times when we think of regulations, we think of FDA. However, for shipments, there are so many regulatory agencies that provide oversight for shipments just because of the type of products that may be in the box. Do you need certain permits, et cetera? So you may have the FDA providing regulations. Most often, if you have a product that's imported, upon a port of entry, your product can automatically be screened or held by the FDA. You also have to think about the Federal Aviation Administration if you are transporting your product on a commercial plane. So things like dry ice limits, and again, track and trace devices, are they allowed once you ship it to a different region? The Department of Transportation, and also making sure that you have the proper documentation and tariffs. And in certain cases, if you have products that may be category A or category B or infectious, you will need to make sure you have the appropriate documentation just so your products aren't held. So you may need to get certain permits, for example, from the CDC or the US Fish and Wildlife Services. And then to add more complexities to the regulation, you also have to think about the actual execution of the trial itself. So ensuring that your trial follows good clinical practices. ensuring that your product for the trial is produced under good manufacturing practices, and then also ensuring that your product is distributed under good distribution practices. And I like to highlight this here because most often there's a misconception of, if I just follow GMPs, then I'm okay when it comes to supply chain. Yes, GMPs are very strict and they are very rigorous. However, good clinical practices, for example, has an entire chapter dedicated to clinical supply chain. So how your product is stored, how it's received, how are you recovering that product? Do you have reverse logistics, and are you reconciling products, the expiration dates, et cetera? And this is an area where the FDA often will cite or provide 483s to clinical sites, and in some cases sponsors, for failing to maintain appropriate clinical trial supply chain records. So how you receive the material, et cetera. And then also for manufacturing, as you manufacture a product, are you following, are you ensuring that the product is safe and secure? And good distribution practices adds another layer as you are looking at things throughout transit, which I'll talk a little bit more in the upcoming slides. And I just wanted to highlight here, again, there's so many regulations, and a lot of challenges for sponsors and manufacturers are that none of the regulations are harmonized. So depending on what region you are in the world, what country you're going to ship your product to, you may have there might be some commonalities, but there may be variation. So I just wanted to highlight a few things that stand out. So for example, in LATAM, they require e-invoices before you ship a product to the country, right? Or Serialization Act and making sure you have certain barcodes. Or again, for EMEA, good distribution practice, and even in Asia Pacific and China, there are other stipulations related to things like in vitro diagnostics and also China medical device good supply chain practice. So it's highly advisable. It's going to be very difficult for someone to memorize all of this. But when you start to think about your clinical trial protocols, what sites you're going to be distributing your product to, it becomes very important for you to understand what the implications are with respect to those regulations, and if there's exceptions required just to prevent your products from being held in transit. And again, if you're looking at good distribution practices, as you can see, this map shows the variety of nuances and differences between good distribution practices. Say, for example, Argentina versus the UK versus India, et cetera. They all have a different version of what their good distribution practices are. In the next slides, I will highlight some of the high level requirements for good distribution practices. But again, it's just very important that you review the applicable regulations just to make sure you're compliant to those regulations and you are not putting your shipment at risk. So good distribution practice is a component of quality assurance that ensures the quality of medicinal product that is maintained through all stages of the supply chain. And this is from the site of the manufacturer to the pharmacy or patient, or it could be in the patient or person authorized or entitled to supply that medical product to the actual public. It does require that you do, if you want to ensure that you're compliant with good distribution practices, many times if you are aligned with GMPs, you're covered. However, there are some nuances. So for example, having a quality management system, making sure you have trained personnel, your premises and equipment. So making sure that your premises are secure. If you're using certain equipment such as refrigerators, are they qualified? If you're using cold rooms, have you validated? Is it temperature mapped? How can you ensure the temperature? Documentation, ensuring you're maintaining your documentation records, your temperature records, your operational aspects, complaint management, and things like corrective and preventative action. If you are outsourcing any activity, making sure that your vendors are qualified. Having self-inspection. So are you doing annual inspections? Are you doing self-audits? Do you have quality management reviews? So are you familiar with your quality management systems, and are you maintaining compliance with your standard operating procedures as applicable? And then things related to transportation. So having temperature controlled vehicles. And then there's also provisions for brokers if you are using a broker, again, when you are transporting your product. Now, some differences between GDP and GMP is that GDP focuses more on storage and handling and distribution. If you are in EMEA or in parts of Europe, you may have a responsible person which is different than a qualified person. Qualified persons actually certify batch releases, whereas responsible persons do not. You also need to focus on increased control and security of your store products, and also things like control of temperature. Are you performing risk assessments on your transit route? So how can you ensure if you need a product to say, for example, to be shipped from the US to China, and it maybe have, if your product only has stability for 24 to 36 hours, are you testing and doing validation runs to ensure that the product is going to reach to the patient in that time allotted before the product loses stability? And then I mentioned this earlier as well. So broker's provisions and ensuring that you don't have a conflict of interest. So now I'm going to turn over to some challenges and considerations. And for these challenges and considerations, I just highlighted some of the key areas for each of the regions. And I'm starting with the Americas region. So first, North America. Is for its strengths. Some of the strengths in North America is the infrastructure. So things like having a major airport in the majority of the cities, as well as having regulatory maturity. So FDA and a lot of the guidelines and standards that are coming out, they do provide some type of level of detail related to GMP, GCP. GDP is not explicitly stated. However, the regulations are pretty mature. Some of the weaknesses are that if you are conducting a clinical trial in North America region, especially from a supply chain standpoint, it is high cost. And again, with a lot of these innovative technologies and things like drones, et cetera, I would say across the board, many of the regions are weak in this area because, again, this is still in the infancy stage, and we don't know the long-term implications. Some threats are product security and product spoilage, and in some case, product damage. And then some opportunities are strategic planning and alignment, and also investment in some supply chain technologies. Now, in contrast, Latin America is lower cost when it comes to clinical trials. There's high growth potential, and there's a lot of innovation and technological advances in Latin America. However, some of the challenges with respect to clinical supply chain is the limited infrastructure. So unlike North America, where you may have a major airport in every city, that is not necessarily the case for Latin America. You can have limited transport access. You might also you may not easily have access to cold chain management, and some of the regulatory areas such as cell and gene therapies, et cetera, are not clearly defined and underdeveloped. Some of the opportunities, though, are investments in logistics facilities, building out technologies, but some of the threats also include inflation and some of the economic conditions. It can make it very unpredictable when it comes to planning a trial. And then in some areas, there are very strict regulations and, again, limited regulatory expertise on how do we deal with some of these newer modalities and newer approaches to supply chain management. When looking at EMEA, I would say out of all of the regions, EMEA is very structured. If you go on the EU website, you will see that there's a lot of guidance documents related to GDP and standards, et cetera. So there's a lot of guidance related to supply chain. And I would say it's much more visibility there in EMEA than it is in the US. So a lot of times sponsors and manufacturers will leverage some of those standards or some of those guidance documents in order to predict or better plan their supply chain management strategy. Some of the weaknesses, similar to Latin America, again, limited infrastructure. Not all of the major cities have airports in certain cases. If you are transporting your product between different countries or different regions of EMEA, you may have to use a truck, or you might have to ship your product via freight or ferry, which can extensively increase your transit times, which can make it very difficult if you have a product that has a very short time span. And then some opportunities, again, would be contingency planning and risk mitigation due to the aforementioned of not having a lot of major airports. And in some cases, such as regions of Africa, for example, you will not have a temperature control vehicle. You may not have access to electricity or water or even like I mentioned, cold chain management. So you also want to provide contingency plans to make sure your product is able to reach the patient for a clinical trial. And then some of the threats are economic tariffs. There's lots of variance region to region, and then also the political environment with Brexit. There's some unpredictability when it comes to how the regulations will pan out for clinical trials as well as supply chain. And then in Asia Pacific and China, innovation and technology is at the forefront. Lots of research and development opportunities. There's so many incubator systems, there's so many clinical trials, and you're able to get a very dynamic patient profile and conduct a trial at a much lower cost, which makes APAC a very attractive area for clinical trials and also sponsors and manufacturers. Some of the weaknesses, again, some areas you may not have access to certain infrastructures, and then you also may need to contingency plan if there's a natural disaster. Some of the threats similar to North America are product safety and product spoilage because of the long, especially if you increase and think about the long transit times. And then many opportunities are strategic partnerships and investments in other areas such as inventory management systems, track and trace technologies, and cold chain technologies that were described earlier prior to this presentation. So lots of opportunity in all of the regions. I would just say, again, as you start to plan your clinical trial, being familiar with the weaknesses or the gaps that may be imposed on your supply chain and just making sure that you almost over plan just so you don't estimate the time that a product may take to actually get to a clinical site and run the risk of your product being spoiled. So now I'll talk briefly about some insights for industry, specifically focusing on supply chain regulations, some strategies and recommendations, and then, like I mentioned, COVID-19. So I wanted to break down some of the challenges that we're seeing in 3 areas: the product profile itself, the clinical trials, which have inherited challenges, and then supply chain overall. And I think you almost have to think about these areas as a trifecta, just because if you don't plan, if you focus on the product, but you don't plan the trial, you may not be able to prove that your trial is safe and effective. Likewise, if you focus on the trial and the product, but you don't necessarily focus on the supply chain, you may run the risk of impacting your clinical trial if your product doesn't get to the patient in time, or if a patient misses a dose and they have to be dropped from the study. So product profile, again, for biologics and many temperature sensitive or time controlled products, they can be very unstable. They can be very complex. Some products, such as cell and gene therapies, are immunogenic. So you have to make sure you're very careful with a chain of identity, chain of custody, and things of that nature. These products, even though they're in a clinical trial phase, they can be very high cost. Again, many of these trials are running between $300,000 to $400,000 per patient. Again, the return on investment is unknown because many trials do not make it to actual market approval. And then again, thinking about some of the challenges with chemistry manufacturing controls that we're not just seeing in the clinical trial phases, but once your product is approved, we are seeing some of these same challenges once the product is commercialized. Now, clinical trials themselves, they also have inherited challenges. So things like patient retention, data integrity. Again, clinical trials have a very high failure rate. Many trials don't make it to phase 3. There's a number of regulations, and as we start to see acceleration on some of these modalities, or even if we think about, for example, it was mentioned earlier, the COVID-19 vaccine, those clinical trials were extremely accelerated. And you also have to think about things like sample size and how you will prove your clinical endpoints in order to get your product deemed safe and effective for market approval. And then from the supply chain standpoint, things like cold chain, the number of regulations. There are knowledge gaps between the industry, supply chain industry, biopharmaceutical industry on what are the appropriate regulations. How should I be, filing some of this documentation, or how should I be doing my import-export documentation? Data retention, and again, cost. And another thing I wanted to mention is visibility. So again, once your product leaves your possession, how do you as a sponsor or manufacturer ensure you have traceability of that package? And then supply chain management and also supplier management. As you start to increase the number of suppliers, it can become very difficult for a sponsor to provide the oversight required to them per their good clinical practice. At the end of the day, if there's a failure in the clinical trial, whether it be product related, clinical trial related, or supply chain related, ultimately the sponsor is responsible for making sure that the trial is executed in an ethical manner, does not impact the health or the safety of a patient. So some respondent reviews. When polled about implementation strategies or implementation challenges, it was found that many smaller organizations, so many organizations coming up the ranks, startups, et cetera, They had challenges with their supply chain, clinical supply chain implementation due to resources, limited expertise, and they also saw vendor management as a challenge. Whereas larger organizations that had a history of commercialized products had more robust CMC plans in place, more robust supply chain strategies in place. They had the funding, they had the infrastructures required to make sure they had a robust supply chain. In many cases, they had SMEs, and they knew what it took to actually have a commercialized product, which made implementation of their supply chain much more easier. The research I conducted also determined that there was dissonance between industry stakeholders. So for example, those that were in either biotech or med device and or pharmaceutical, they were very familiar with GMPs and in many cases GCPs. However, many were not familiar with the requirements of things like, good documentation practice, import, export, and even other regulations related to the Federal Aviation Association. Many of them had challenges with that. And in many cases, they outsourced to a third party to compensate for that knowledge gap. And then looking at regulatory overall, about half of the respondents felt that our current FDA guidelines that are in place for GMP and GCP were sufficient in order to provide guidance for supply chain strategies. They also felt that there was sufficient guidance, and in some cases that the FDA should have more oversight for third-party providers that are distributing medical products that are a part of a clinical trial. About 81% felt that GDP regulations should be adopted and enforced by the FDA in the US, and also 60% felt that clinical supply chain regulations should be flexible, though, and risk-based based on the product profile and the type of clinical trial that was being conducted. And then about 29%, give or take, disagreed that there was sufficient guidance for clinical supply chain specifically. So a lot of the data that is out there, standards and guidelines that I mentioned, much of that material is focused on commercialized product. It's very limited material that is focused on clinical trials. So again, this was an area of opportunity. And most importantly, the thought of about having regulators come together and harmonize and standardize a lot of these transport regulations and requirements to make it easier on sponsors as they are planning out their clinical supply chain management strategies. Other areas that came up that I wanted to bucket, again, global considerations, regulatory considerations, things about how you're going to meet transit line, your transit or your validation requirements. Resources, again, resources kept coming up. In certain cases, there were organizations that did not have a dedicated supply chain department, or in some cases, there may be one person managing the entire trial from finish to end. This again was more seen when you have a startup that is conducting a clinical trial. Stakeholder engagement, so things like communication and getting buy-in. Many times clinical trials can be planned in silo, right? So for example, you might have the clinical team, CMC team, quality, regulatory, et cetera. But there are other stakeholders that are involved and should be considered when you're thinking about your supply chain strategy, such as the hospitals you're going to use. Ensuring that you incorporate the clinical sites, that they're trained on your clinical trial protocol. Also things like airline handlers and making sure that you are providing and setting them up best they can for them to, move your product. In many cases, again, these industries are not under the purview of FDA. They have different infrastructures, different systems. So you almost want to make sure that you do that stakeholder engagement up front, as well as plan and forecast in order you to plan and forecast accurately, making sure that when you have suppliers that you bring them into the fold, you work with them on standard operating procedures, and you look at it as a partnership to ensure that they are familiar with your regulations that you are required for your product and also your clinical trial protocol. Making sure you're thinking about things like material management. Do you need certain, tubing? Do you need certain active ingredients? What is the accessibility of these ingredients? And again, COVID-19 put a limitation on some of these things. And in certain cases, many trials had to be halted due to lack of inventory supply or the availability of supply. And then again, data and documentation. There are a lot of challenges for sponsors and manufacturers. In many cases, they weren't able to reconcile temperature information. They weren't able to provide traceability on the shipments. And that could be because documentation was lost in transit, et cetera. However, in many cases, once your clinical trial closes, you will have to, and go to submit your application, whether it be a new drug application or a BLA, a biological license application. If you have any temperature excursions that have taken place during your clinical trial, you do have to document that, and you do have to provide evidence of what was done, what happened with that material. Did you use the material? Did you have a corrective action? So this is where data and documentation becomes very important. What I've seen from my experience is that most often data and documentation is not requested until the end of the trial, and that can set a sponsor up for failure if they're not able to reconcile that documentation in a timely manner. If you have a trial, for example, that is 3 to 4 years, and you're not able to reconcile that documentation from 2 years ago or a year ago, it may be very difficult to explain, and it may be perceived that you don't have true traceability or control of your supply chain. So looking at COVID-19, again, COVID-19, I would say would be considered a disruptor to supply chain. However, I do think it brought about a lot of visibility to the importance of supply chain. There are approximately 1,100 or so clinical trials that were stopped during their period. And in some cases, these trials did not pick back up. Some were suspended, some were withdrawn. There were limited access to clinical sites. So that could be due to restrictions in flight, or in some cases, some patients just couldn't make it to the hospital due to the number of patients that may have had COVID-19. Patient recruitment took a hit, and it became also very difficult for sponsors to adhere to their clinical trial protocol. So in certain cases, contingency plans or risk mitigation plans had to be implemented to keep the trial going. I kind of touched on this earlier. The availability of supplies and raw materials still, I think, in certain cases, still poses a challenge, depending on what type of material you're using. We saw staff shortages, change in patient care, and again, overall, the supply chain due to flight cancellations, et cetera, became very unpredictable from a clinical trial standpoint. I think, though, there were a lot of lessons learned from COVID-19. COVID-19 did increase the visibility of some of the supply chain gaps in the industry and bottlenecks, not just from a commercial standpoint, but also clinical trial standpoint, and understanding, stockouts, and also having the availability of inventory to better serve the patient. Contingency plans and having business continuity plans. And as I mentioned, with the trial adherence challenges, we did see an adaptation of innovation, how to provide alternative clinical trial models. And I think this kind of catapulted the acceleration of the revision of good clinical practices to incorporate some of these things like innovative technology, real world evidence, et cetera, in the new version, which is ICH E6 revision 3, which is currently with the working group. Again, hasn't been completed yet, but I would say if you look at revision 1 versus revision 2, which took on over 15 years, I would say COVID-19 probably accelerated the thought of how can we get products to patients in a quicker manner, in a most effective manner, and how can we best use the technologies that we are having. And then we also saw collaboration among stakeholders. So Operation Warp Speed, for the first time, everyone came together. Many pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, supply chain companies came together in order to help with the development of the COVID-19 vaccine, the distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine. And again, I think this is the first that we've seen in the history of, having COVID-19. The pandemic is something very outlier, something very unusual, but I think it was important to see the collaboration with industry stakeholders and how we were able to get COVID-19 vaccine created and developed and approved. And I want to say in a very, unexpected and accelerated manner. So what are some conclusions? So supply chain, I would say specifically for things like advanced therapies, have very unique considerations and priorities. Even with innovation, clinical supply chain is still quite challenging for the industry. And again, due to this unpredictability of the different clinical trial designs. And also, again, tailoring the supply chain to the patients. Patients are becoming much more vocal about their health, wanting to participate in clinical trials. So it's almost like you have to be very considerate of that when creating your supply chain strategies. There's still knowledge gaps in different areas, right? So many times you're going to see challenges at a hospital, for example. many hospital personnel are not familiar with good clinical practices or GMPs. So it's going to be much more important for, again, sponsors to over communicate and ensure protocol adherence. Harmonization can better assist sponsors, but right now, a lot of these innovations like technology in many cases are outpacing regulations and guidance documents. So we almost need to get the guidance documents to be created in parallel as we start to see a lot of these new modalities. A lot of these standards are being created retrospectively. And then COVID-19, again, it was a catastrophic event, I would say, across the board for the entire world. However, there were some things like innovation of technology, improvements in drug development, ways to obtain faster approval, and also getting buy-in and support from many industry stakeholders in an effort to get the COVID-19 vaccine developed and also to patients in a quick manner. Some recommendations are plan your supply chain early. Don't wait to the last minute. Don't see it as an afterthought. Not just, creating your clinical supply chain strategy early, but also think about if you had to scale up, do you have the availability to do so? And can your supply chain strategy withstand commercialization? Project plans should be established for all stakeholders. The key takeaway from a regulatory standpoint, again, is harmonization and potentially having the FDA to enforce good distribution practices to better align the US with the rest of the world, and also to continue to improve some of these industry collaborations and transparency to better help sponsors and manufacturers, again, from a clinical supply chain standpoint. And then with a lot of these new modalities, like I mentioned, drones, direct to patient, more research is needed to see how this will pan out from a regulatory standpoint and how supply chain looks in a site setting, hospital setting, in a patient's home. If you were shipping something, via drone, how does validation studies, all of these things have areas of opportunity for us to research, but also to create maybe standards and guidances for the industry. And with that being said, that concludes my presentation, and I will now open it up to questions and answers.